called her useless, a burden, a mistake born with a limp that marked her as worthless in a world that measured value by perfection. Elara had learned to live in the shadows, invisible to everyone except when they needed someone to mock. But on one gray morning, when a captured Viking warrior was dragged into her village in chains, she was given a task no one else wanted: to keep the enemy alive until his execution. What she didn't expect was that the man with ice-blue eyes would see her differently, that he would look past her limp, past her fear, and see something even she had forgotten existed. In a damp prison cell beneath the church, two worlds collided: a seamstress who'd been taught she was nothing, and a warrior who'd lost everything. As she cleaned his wounds and he shared stories of distant seas, something impossible began to grow between them, a connection that defied every law, every hatred, every reason that said they should remain enemies. But when she discovered the amulet hidden beneath his shirt, everything changed. The symbol that revealed his true identity, the blood that ran through his veins, the terrible secret that could destroy them both. Because the man she was falling in love with wasn't just any Viking. He was the son of the monster who had slaughtered her people. And when the village discovered the truth, they demanded his death at dawn. Elara faced an impossible choice: let him die and save herself, or risk everything for a love that should never have existed. What she decided in that moment would force her to discover just how much courage lived inside the girl everyone had called useless. And as the execution bells began to toll, she made a choice that would change both their lives forever. The stone square echoed with laughter as Elara stumbled, her basket of fabrics scattering across the cobblestones like autumn leaves caught in an unforgiving wind. Children pointed and jeered, their voices sharp as needles. Men turned their faces away as if the sight of her limping gait might curse their day. Women gathered in tight circles, whispering behind cupped hands, their words more cutting than any blade forged in the village smithy. "The useless one strikes again," someone called out, and the crowd erupted in cruel amusement. Ilara's cheeks burned crimson as she knelt to gather the scattered cloth, her damaged leg making each movement a small torture. Her fingers trembled as they reached for a piece of emerald fabric that had landed near a merchant's boot. He kicked it aside without looking at her, as if even her touch might taint his goods. This was her life. This had always been her life. Since the day her father, the village tailor, had fallen from his horse and broken his neck, leaving her orphaned at 10 years old, she had been marked. The limp in her left leg, a cruel gift from birth, had sealed her fate. In a world where strength meant survival and beauty meant a future, Elara possessed neither. At 23 years old, she remained unmarried, unwanted, a burden the village tolerated only because her needle could still mend torn cloth, and her silence never demanded much in return. Yet there was something in her eyes that the villagers failed to see. Behind the curtain of shame and loneliness burned a quiet dignity, a resilience that even years of mockery could not extinguish. When she looked up at the gray November sky, her gaze held depths that spoke of unspoken dreams and a heart that refused to accept its cage. That morning, however, brought something more than the usual cruelty. The village square buzzed with an electric tension, thick as smoke from the blacksmith's forge. News had arrived before dawn. Vikings had been captured after a bloody skirmish in the northern hills. 3 had died in battle. 1 remained alive, chained and wounded, brought back as a prize of war. Elara felt the shift in the air before she heard the approaching horses. The crowd that had been mocking her moments before now pressed forward, hungry for spectacle. She pulled herself up, clutching her gathered fabrics, and found herself caught in the surge of bodies moving toward the village center. And then she saw him. The Viking warrior was dragged from a cart, iron shackles binding his wrists and ankles. Even wounded and defeated, he stood nearly a head taller than the tallest village man. His hair, the color of sun-bleached wheat, fell in matted tangles past his shoulders. Blood stained his torn tunic, revealing skin marked with scars that told stories of survival. But it was his eyes that struck Elara like lightning splitting a tree, pale blue, cold as northern ice, yet burning with something she could not name. They were not the eyes of a man begging for mercy. They were the eyes of someone who had stared death in the face so many times that fear had become a stranger. "Kill the barbarian!" someone shouted. "Burn him! Make him suffer as our men suffered." The crowd's bloodlust grew with each passing moment. Father Benedict, the village priest, raised his weathered hands for silence. His voice cut through the chaos with the authority of decades spent shepherding reluctant souls. "We are Christians," he declared, his words measured and heavy. "We do not murder prisoners without trial. This man will be judged, but until that day comes, he must be tended to. His wounds must be cleaned. He must be kept alive to face justice." A thick silence fell over the square. No one moved. No one volunteered. The Viking's wounds looked deep, his fever evident even from a distance. To tend him meant entering the damp, dark cells beneath the church. It meant touching enemy flesh, risking disease or worse. It meant associating oneself with the very evil the village had fought against. Father Benedict's eyes scanned the crowd, growing darker with each passing moment of silence. And then, like a wolf spotting the weakest lamb, his gaze fell upon Alara, half hidden behind a merchant's cart. "You," he said, pointing directly at her. "Alara, daughter of Thomas the tailor, you will tend to the prisoner." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, not the cruel laughter from before, but something more sinister. A collective satisfaction at seeing the useless girl finally put to proper use. "Perfect," someone called out. "Let the cripple tend the dying barbarian. Neither is worth anything anyway. If he kills her, nothing of value is lost." The words struck Alara like physical blows, but she had learned long ago to absorb such pain without flinching. She met Father Benedict's eyes and nodded once, her jaw set with determination that surprised even herself. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the village and torches were lit against the gathering darkness, Alara descended the narrow stone steps leading to the cells beneath the church. The air grew colder with each step, thick with dampness and the smell of earth. Her small lantern cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed to close in around her. The Viking lay on a pile of straw in the farthest cell. The chains binding him to the wall clinked softly as his chest rose and fell with labored breaths. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached, her medical supplies clutched in trembling hands. Clean cloth, water, herbs her father had once taught her to use. She knelt beside him and, for the first time, saw him clearly in the lantern light. His face, though marked by bruises and dried blood, possessed a harsh beauty. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, lips cracked from dehydration. But it was when his eyes opened and fixed upon her that time seemed to stop. There was no plea in that gaze, no fear, only a piercing assessment, as if he were measuring whether she came as healer or executioner. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, something shifted in the fabric of both their lives. Neither could have named it then. Neither understood that in this damp cell, beneath stone and earth and the weight of a world that wanted them to remain separate, a thread had been pulled that would unravel everything they thought they knew about themselves. Alara reached forward with the damp cloth, her hand shaking. "I'm here to help you," she whispered in a voice barely audible, more to herself than to him. The Viking said nothing, but as her fingers touched his fevered skin, beginning to clean the blood from a deep gash across his temple, something passed between them, something neither the village above nor the darkness surrounding them could touch. The first stitch in a tapestry that would take both their lives to complete. The first 3 days passed in suffocating silence. Eirik, she had learned his name from the guards who spat it like a curse, refused to speak. He watched her with those ice-blue eyes, tracking every movement as a predator studies prey. When Alara entered the cell each morning with fresh water and clean bandages, his gaze followed her limping steps with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She could feel him calculating, measuring, perhaps searching for weakness he could exploit for escape. But Alara had learned patience through years of isolation. She cleaned his wounds methodically, her touch gentle despite the trembling in her fingers. She stitched the deeper gashes with the same precision her father had taught her for mending torn silk, small, careful stitches that would heal clean. And when his fever burned highest in the night, she sat beside him in the darkness, placing cool cloths on his forehead while he thrashed against dreams she could not see. Eric never thanked her, never acknowledged her care beyond those watchful eyes. Yet he never pulled away from her touch either. On the fourth day, as afternoon light filtered weakly through the cell's single-barred window, something shifted. Ilara was mending his torn tunic, her needle moving in the rhythmic dance she knew better than breathing. The fabric was rough, foreign, woven differently than anything in her village. Her fingers traced the strange patterns as she worked, and she found herself wondering about the hands that had made it, the life this man had lived before chains bound him to damp stone. "Why do you help me?" His voice startled her so badly that the needle pricked her finger. A small bead of blood welled up, bright crimson against her pale skin. She looked up to find him watching her with something new in his expression, not suspicion, but genuine confusion. Ilara pressed her bleeding finger against her dress and met his gaze. "Because no one else would," she answered simply, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between them in the musty air. Eric's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then something in his face cracked, some carefully maintained wall that had kept him separate, protected. His eyes, which had been hard as winter ice, softened almost imperceptibly. "You're afraid of me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ilara admitted, because lying seemed pointless. "But I'm afraid of most things. It doesn't change what needs to be done." A strange sound escaped him, almost like a laugh, but rougher, as if he'd forgotten how. He looked down at his chained wrists, then back at her. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as enemy or servant, but as a person. He noticed the way her hands trembled even as they worked with steady precision. The delicate features of her face that seemed too soft for the harsh world she inhabited. The quiet strength disguised as timidity. "What happened to your leg?" he asked, his accent thick but his English clearer than she'd expected. The question caught her off guard. No one in the village asked about her limp anymore. It simply existed, like the color of her hair or the shape of her nose. An unfortunate fact to be ignored or mocked, never discussed. "I was born this way," she said, returning to her stitching. "My mother died bringing me into the world. Some say God marked me as punishment for her sins." "That's foolish," Eric said bluntly. "The gods don't waste their time punishing infants. You breathe, you walk, that's all that matters." Ilara looked up, startled by the matter-of-fact tone. In her world, her disability defined her worth. But in his words, she heard something different. An acceptance so simple, it felt revolutionary. Days began to blur together after that. The silence between them transformed into something else. Tentative conversations that grew longer with each visit. Eric spoke of the sea, his voice carrying a longing that made her chest ache. He described storms that could swallow ships whole, waves tall as mountains, horizons that stretched forever. He told her of battles fought and brothers lost, of a life spent chasing glory that always seemed just beyond reach. Ilara, in turn, shared her smaller world. She spoke of fabrics and threads, of the way different materials held light differently. She told him about her father, how he'd taught her that every stitch was a small act of creation, that mending something broken was its own kind of magic. She described the loneliness that had been her constant companion since his death, how the village had slowly erased her as if she were a mistake waiting to be forgotten. The cell became something unexpected, a refuge from the world above. When Ilara descended those stone steps, she left behind the mockery and scorn. Here, in the dampness and darkness, she was simply herself. And Eric, stripped of his warrior's pride by chains and defeat, allowed himself to be simply a man. One evening, as she rebandaged a wound on his shoulder, their hands touched. It was brief, accidental, but the contact sent electricity through her entire body. Eric felt it too. She saw his eyes widen slightly, saw the way his breath caught. Neither of them pulled away immediately. "You have gentle hands," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, like summer rain. Ilara's cheeks flushed. No one had ever spoken to her with such tenderness. She focused intently on the bandage, afraid to meet his eyes, afraid of what she might see reflected there. "They're just hands," she whispered. "No," Eric said, and there was certainty in his voice that made her look up despite herself. They're the hands that saved my life. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Outside the cell, the world continued. Guards changed shifts, the village slept and woke, and enemies remained enemies. But inside these stone walls, something impossible had begun to grow. A connection that defied logic and loyalty, that should not exist, but somehow did. Yet beyond the cell door, darkness gathered. The guard who brought Eric's evening meal had noticed how long Ilara stayed each day. He saw the way the prisoner's eyes followed her, the way she no longer flinched when entering. Whispers began to spread through the village like poison in a well. The useless girl and the barbarian, alone together in the darkness. What could possibly come from that, except shame? As Ilara climbed the stone steps that night, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She didn't notice the cold stares from the guards, didn't hear the murmured conversations that stopped when she passed. She was thinking of ice-blue eyes and a voice that spoke to her as if she mattered. And in his cell, Eric touched the fresh bandage on his shoulder and felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember: hope. The storm arrived on the 7th night, rattling the village shutters and turning the streets into rivers of mud. Rain hammered against the church roof with such fury that it seemed the heavens themselves were angry. Ilara descended the stone steps carefully, her lantern casting wild shadows as thunder shook the very foundation beneath her feet. When she reached Eric's cell, she found him in the grip of fever once more. His massive frame trembled against the cold stone, sweat coating his skin despite the chill that permeated the underground chamber. But worse than the physical suffering were the sounds escaping his lips, words in a language she couldn't understand, flowing like water over rocks, sometimes soft as prayer, sometimes desperate as a drowning man's final breath. Ilara knelt beside him, pressing her palm to his burning forehead. His eyes were closed, lost somewhere between sleep and delirium. The words kept coming, tumbling from his mouth in rhythms that felt ancient, important. She caught fragments that sounded like names, like pleas, like promises made to people she would never know. "Eric," she whispered, dampening a cloth and placing it across his brow. "You need to fight this, please." His hand shot out suddenly, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes opened, but didn't see her. They looked through her, past her, into some distant horror only he could perceive. More foreign words spilled out, urgent now, almost frantic. Then, just as suddenly, his grip loosened, and he fell back into fitful unconsciousness. Ilara stayed through the night, changing the cloths, whispering words of comfort he couldn't hear. When dawn finally broke and his fever subsided, she climbed the steps exhausted, her dress soaked with rain and sweat, her heart heavy with worry. Father Benedict was waiting at the top of the stairs. "A word, child," he said, his voice carrying a warning she'd learned to recognize. They walked to the chapel, empty at this early hour. Morning light filtered through stained glass, painting the floor in pools of red and blue. The priest turned to face her, his weathered face grave. "You spend too much time with the prisoner," he said carefully. "People are beginning to talk." "I'm only doing what you commanded, Father," Ilara replied, keeping her eyes lowered in the deference expected of her. "I commanded you to tend his wounds, not to linger in darkness with him." The priest's tone softened slightly. "I know your life has been hard, Ilara. I know the loneliness you carry. But you must not attach yourself to this man. He is the enemy. When he heals, he will face judgment, and that judgment will not be merciful." The words struck her like physical blows, but she nodded silently. What could she say? That somewhere in the darkness of that cell she had found the first person who looked at her and saw value? That his stories of distant seas had awakened dreams she'd thought long dead? That the way he spoke her name made her feel like someone worth knowing? She said none of these things. Instead, she whispered, "Yes, Father," and left the chapel with her heart in pieces. That afternoon, despite her exhaustion, Ilara returned to the cell. Eric was awake, propped against the wall, his color better, though his eyes held a hollowness that hadn't been there before. "You stayed," he said simply as she entered. "You were sick," she replied, unpacking fresh bandages. As she worked, checking his wounds with practiced efficiency, Her fingers brushed against something hard beneath his torn tunic. Eric stiffened immediately, but fever had weakened him enough that he couldn't stop her when curiosity made her investigate. Hidden against his chest, suspended on a leather cord, hung an amulet she hadn't noticed before. It was silver, tarnished with age, carved with the image of a wolf mid-howl, but it was the symbols etched around the wolf that made her breath catch. Runes, angular and strange, that seemed to pulse with meaning she couldn't grasp. "Don't," Eric said, his voice rough with something between anger and fear. But Alara had already lifted the amulet, studying it in the weak light. The wolf's eyes seemed to follow her, and the runes felt important in a way that made her skin prickle. "What is this?" she asked softly. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, reaching for it, but the chains held him just short. "Give it back." Instead, driven by an instinct she didn't understand, Alara carefully tucked the amulet back beneath his tunic and climbed the stairs. She found Father Benedict in his chamber, surrounded by ancient books and scrolls. "Father," she said hesitantly, "I found something, a symbol. I need to know what it means." She described the wolf and drew the runes as best she could remember on a scrap of parchment. The priest's face transformed as he studied her crude sketches. Color drained from his cheeks. His hands began to shake. "Where did you see this?" he demanded, his voice barely controlled. "On the prisoner. He wears it beneath his clothes." Father Benedict stood abruptly, pacing to the window. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "This symbol belongs to the Wolf clan of the North. They're not mere raiders, Alara. They're the sworn enemies of this kingdom. 20 years ago, their leader massacred an entire garrison, including the Lord's brother. We've been at war with them ever since." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with something between pity and warning. "The man in our cell isn't just any Viking. He's the son of that leader. He's the heir to our enemy's throne." The world seemed to tilt beneath Alara's feet. Her hands went numb. The man she had cared for, the person she had begun to feel impossibly drawn to, carried the blood of murderers. His people had killed soldiers from her own land. His very existence represented everything she should hate. She descended the stairs in a daze, her mind a storm worse than the one that had passed. Eric looked up as she entered, and immediately his expression changed. He saw the knowledge in her eyes, the way she held herself differently now, not with fear, but with the weight of terrible understanding. "You found out," he said flatly. Alara stood at the edge of the cell, the lantern trembling in her grip. "The Wolf clan," she whispered. "You're one of them." Eric's jaw clenched. He looked away, chains clinking softly. "My father's son," he said bitterly, "though I doubt he would claim me now. Your people killed our soldiers, innocent men with families, and your people have killed mine." He shot back, then immediately seemed to regret the harshness. His voice softened. "War makes monsters of everyone, Alara. I didn't choose my blood any more than you chose your leg." The comparison stung, perhaps because it held truth. She took a step closer, then stopped, torn between the pull she felt toward him and the weight of what she now knew. "You should never have seen that amulet," Eric said quietly, turning his face to the wall. "It would have been easier for both of us." Alara stood in the darkness, holding her lantern, feeling the last threads of innocence unravel around her. The man before her was her enemy. Logic demanded she hate him. Duty demanded she turn away. But her heart, that traitorous organ, recognized only the person who had treated her with kindness when the world offered none. "I wish I hadn't," she finally whispered, though even as she spoke, she wasn't sure it was true. She left without tending his wounds that day. And as she climbed the stairs, she felt the distance between them growing with each step, a chasm opening that perhaps was always meant to be there. Yet even as she told herself to let him go, to forget the way he made her feel seen, her fingers touched the spot over her heart, as if trying to hold on to something already slipping away. The secret spread through the village like plague through a crowded street. By midday, everyone knew. The prisoner wasn't just a captured Viking. He was the son of Ragnar the Merciless, the Wolf clan leader whose name mothers whispered to frighten disobedient children. The man who had burned villages, slaughtered the Lord's own brother, left widows weeping and orphans starving. Ilara heard the whispers everywhere she went. In the market square, women clutched their shawls tighter and spat on the ground as she passed. Men who had previously ignored her now stared with undisguised contempt. Children threw stones at her back, calling her traitor's friend, and worse. By evening, a crowd had gathered in the square, their torches painting the twilight in shades of orange and crimson. Lord William himself had ridden from his manor, his face carved from granite, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The entire village seemed to pulse with a single terrible desire: vengeance. "The prisoner will be executed at dawn," Lord William announced, his voice carrying over the angry murmurs. "The son will pay for the father's sins. Justice will finally be served." A roar of approval shook the very stones beneath Ilara's feet. She stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible as always, but this time her invisibility felt like drowning. Her chest constricted until she couldn't breathe. Everything inside her screamed to stay silent, to let fate take its course, to protect herself from the storm about to break. But her feet carried her forward anyway. She pushed through the crowd, her limp making progress slow and awkward. People shoved her aside, cursed at her, but she kept moving until she stood before Lord William himself. The crowd fell silent, shocked that the useless girl would dare approach the Lord. "Please," Ilara said, her voice trembling but determined. "He hasn't been tried. You can't execute him without..." "Without what?" Lord William interrupted, his eyes cold as winter steel. "Without a trial? The evidence of his blood is trial enough. His father murdered my brother, girl. Justice delayed is not justice denied." "But he's not his father," Ilara insisted, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. "He's just a man who has bewitched a simple-minded cripple," someone shouted from the crowd, and cruel laughter followed. Lord William raised his hand for silence. He studied Ilara with something between pity and disgust. "Go home, girl. Be grateful I don't punish you for your foolishness. At dawn, the Viking dies. That is final." The crowd dispersed slowly, their bloodlust satisfied by the promise of morning execution. Ilara stood alone in the emptying square as darkness fell completely, her whole body shaking with the weight of helplessness. She waited until the village slept before making her way to the church. The guard at the door was old Martin, who had known her father. He looked at her with sad eyes but didn't stop her when she descended the stairs one final time. Eric sat with his back against the wall, his chains pooled around him like metal serpents. He looked up as she entered, and the expression on his face nearly broke her. It wasn't fear. Vikings didn't fear death, she'd learned. It was resignation mixed with something deeper, something that looked almost like regret. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly. Ilara set down her lantern and moved closer, no longer caring about propriety or distance. She knelt beside him, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, close enough to count the faint scars on his jaw. "They're going to kill you at dawn," she whispered, though he surely already knew. "I know." His voice was steady, accepting. "I've died many times before in my mind. Once more won't make much difference." "Don't say that," Ilara said, and tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "Don't act like your life means nothing." Eric reached up with his chained hands and, with surprising gentleness, caught a tear on his thumb. "Don't cry for me, little seamstress. I've lived more than many men do in twice the years. I've seen the northern lights dance across ice fields. I felt wind that could steal your breath and rain that could wash away sins. I've fought and loved and lived. But none of your deaths were just," Ilara said, her voice breaking. "You're not your father. You didn't choose his path. You don't deserve this." Something shifted in Eric's expression. He looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, or perhaps the last. "How do you know what I deserve?" he asked quietly. "You know nothing of what I've done, the blood on my hands." "I know you," Ilara insisted. "I know the man who told me stories of the sea, who looked at my limp and saw nothing wrong, who made me feel like I mattered for the first time in my life." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I know the man I've fallen in love with, even though I shouldn't have." The words hung between them in the damp air, impossible and true. Eric's eyes widened, and for a moment the hardened warrior disappeared entirely, leaving only a man confronted with something he'd never expected to find, especially not here in chains on the eve of his death. "Elara," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like prayer and curse combined. "You can't." "I know I can't," she interrupted. "I know it's foolish and impossible and wrong by every measure, but knowing doesn't change what I feel." Eric closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they glistened with moisture she'd never seen there before. "In another life," he said hoarsely, "in another world, I would have courted you properly, brought you flowers that grow on mountain peaks, taken you sailing until we found horizons no one had ever seen. I would have—" He stopped, swallowing hard. Elara reached out and took his chained hands in hers, no longer trembling, no longer afraid. "Then give me this life," she whispered. "Give me this moment, even if it's all we have." Something broke in Eric then. The last wall he'd kept between them. He leaned forward as far as his chains would allow, and Elara met him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, tentative as spring rain, then deeper, desperate with the knowledge that dawn would steal everything. His chained hands rose to cradle her face, and she felt the cold metal against her skin, the warmth of his touch, the impossible rightness of something so thoroughly wrong. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the flickering lantern light. "I won't let them kill you," Elara said with sudden fierce determination. "I don't know how yet, but I won't." "You can't save me," Eric said gently, "and I won't let you destroy yourself trying." But Elara was already standing, her mind racing through possibilities she'd never dared consider before. She'd spent her whole life being careful, invisible, obedient. She'd accepted her place as the useless one, the burden, the mistake. But love, this impossible, foolish love, had awakened something in her that felt like courage. "I know every shadow in this village," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Every hidden path, every unwatched corner. I know when the guards change and when they sleep. I know where the horses are kept and which roads lead to the coast." Eric stood as well, his chains rattling. "Elara, no, you taught me something," she interrupted, looking at him with eyes that no longer held any trace of the frightened girl who'd first entered this cell. "You taught me that I'm more than what they call me, that my worth isn't measured by their acceptance. If I'm damned already in their eyes, I might as well earn it." The church bells began to toll midnight. 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours to attempt the impossible. "Trust me," Elara whispered, and before Eric could protest further, she was gone, climbing the stairs with purpose instead of fear, her limp no longer a weakness but simply part of who she was, a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The dawn bells never rang for Eric's execution. When the guards descended to the cell at first light, they found empty chains and a door that shouldn't have opened hanging wide. Old Martin lay unconscious but breathing, a careful blow to the head that spoke of mercy rather than murder. The village erupted in chaos, torches blazing even in daylight, search parties forming before most people had finished breakfast. But by then, Elara was already miles away. She had fled east toward the coast, where the land grew wild and the villages sparse. Her legs burned with exhaustion, her lungs screamed for air, but she pushed forward through forests and across streams, driven by fear and something stronger, the memory of Eric's kiss, the weight of his chains falling away under her trembling hands, the way he'd looked at her when he realized what she'd done. "You've damned yourself for me," he'd whispered as they'd slipped through the darkness. "Then we're damned together," she'd replied. But they'd been forced to separate at the forest's edge. Eric insisted. Together they were too easily spotted, too obvious. He would draw the search parties north while she escaped to the coast. They would find each other again, he promised. He would come back for her. Now, 3 days later, Elara stood before an abandoned fisherman's cabin perched on rocks overlooking the gray sea. The structure leaned like a drunk man, half its roof missing, walls weathered silver by salt and time. But it offered shelter, and more importantly, isolation. No one had lived here in years, not since the fishing grounds had moved further south. She pushed open the creaking door and entered her new home. The first weeks blurred together in a haze of survival. Ilara had brought almost nothing, her father's sewing needle tucked in her dress pocket, the wolf amulet Eric had pressed into her hands before they parted, and a small pouch of coins she'd stolen from the church offerings. Guilt over that theft kept her awake some nights, but hunger silenced guilt quickly enough. She learned to catch fish in the tide pools, to gather mussels from the rocks, to identify which plants growing in the sandy soil were edible and which would make her sick. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, grew calloused and strong. The limp that had defined her entire life became merely a fact, no more remarkable than the color of the sky. But it was the nights that tested her most. When darkness fell and the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, loneliness wrapped around her throat like fingers. She would sit by the small fire she'd learned to build, clutching Eric's amulet, and wonder if he was alive, if he'd been captured, if he'd forgotten the frightened seamstress who'd freed him. To keep from drowning in doubt, she worked. A traveling merchant had passed by the coastal road one day, and Ilara had traded her mother's ring, the only thing of value she'd carried, for canvas, thread, and materials. She began sewing sails for the fishing boats that occasionally anchored in the nearby cove. The work was harder than mending clothes, the canvas rough and unforgiving, but her stitches were small and perfect, and word spread among the fishermen that someone skilled lived in the abandoned cabin. They paid her in food and cloth, in silence. They asked no questions about the young woman living alone. Coastal people understood that some stories were better left untold. Every sail she stitched became a prayer. She imagined them catching wind that would bring Eric back to her. She pictured him standing on a ship's deck, the sun catching his golden hair, his eyes scanning the coastline for the place where she waited. Each stitch was hope made tangible, love transformed into something that could carry ships across impossible distances. Sometimes, on clear days, she would walk to the cliff's edge and stare at the horizon until her eyes ached. The sea stretched forever, gray-green and endless, holding secrets she couldn't fathom. Was he out there somewhere? Had he found his people? Or had the forest taken him? Had soldiers found him? Had he? She never let herself finish that thought. 6 weeks after her escape, Ilara woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Her heart seized with terror. She'd been found. The soldiers had finally tracked her down. She grabbed the gutting knife she kept for cleaning fish and pressed herself against the wall, waiting. The door opened slowly, and there he stood. Eric looked like he'd walked through hell itself. His clothes hung in tatters, new scars crossed his arms and chest, and he'd lost weight that he couldn't afford to lose. A rough beard covered his jaw, and exhaustion carved lines around his eyes. But those eyes, those ice-blue eyes, found her across the dim cabin and lit up with something that made her knees weak. Neither of them spoke. Words felt insufficient for the moment, too small to contain what they felt. Ilara dropped the knife and Eric crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He pulled her against his chest, and she felt his heart hammering against her cheek, proof that he was real, alive, here. "You came back," she whispered into his shirt, breathing in the smell of him, salt and sweat and something wild. "I promised," he said hoarsely, his arms tightening around her as if she might disappear. "Did you doubt me?" "Every day," Ilara admitted, pulling back to look at his face. Her hands rose to touch his cheeks, to trace the new scars, to confirm he was truly standing before her. "Every single day." Eric caught her hands and pressed his lips to her palms, then her wrists, then pulled her close again. "I'm here now," he murmured against her hair. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving again." They stood like that as the sun rose over the sea, painting the water in shades of pink and gold. 2 people who shouldn't exist together, holding each other as if they could stop the world from tearing them apart through sheer will alone. Later, as they sat by the fire sharing the meager food Ilara had, Eric told his story. He'd fled north, led soldiers on a chase through territories he knew from childhood raids. He'd hidden in caves, stolen from farms, fought when cornered. He'd made it nearly to the border of Viking territory before realizing he couldn't cross it. His own people would kill him for the failure that had led to his capture, for surviving when his crew had died. He was a man without a country now, belonging nowhere. "So I came back," he said simply, looking at her across the fire, "because the only place I belong is wherever you are." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad. For the first time in her life, she felt complete. Not because he completed her, she'd learned these weeks that she was whole on her own, but because they chose each other, fully and freely, despite every reason not to. That night, they lay together on the cabin floor, wrapped in the only blanket she owned, listening to the sea crash against the rocks below. Eric held her close, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her shoulder. "What do we do now?" Ilara asked softly. "We survive," Eric replied. "Together, that's all that matters." Outside, the world still wanted them separated. Soldiers still searched. Villages still whispered. But in that moment, in that broken cabin by the endless sea, they had found something worth more than safety or acceptance. They had found each other, and for now, that was enough. Ilara pressed her lips to his chest, right over his heart, and whispered, "I love you." "And I love you," Eric answered, his voice rough with emotion. "My brave, beautiful seamstress. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." They fell asleep, tangled together. Two souls that had found home in each other, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible, but felt, in that moment, almost within reach. Hope, Ilara learned, was a dangerous companion. It made you forget that the world rarely forgave those who defied it. For 2 weeks, she and Eric lived in a stolen paradise by the sea. They repaired the cabin together, his strength and her careful planning transforming the wreck into something resembling a home. In the mornings, they fished. In the afternoons, she stitched sails while he mended nets, their hands working in comfortable rhythm. And at night, they held each other close, whispering dreams of a life beyond running, beyond fear. Eric taught her words in his language: sky, wave, love. She taught him to sew simple stitches, laughing when his large warrior's hands fumbled with the delicate needle. They kissed beneath stars that seemed to bless what the world condemned, and in those moments, Ilara believed they might actually escape their fate. But fate, she discovered, was a patient hunter. The signs started small. A fisherman who usually brought them supplies arrived nervous, speaking in hurried whispers about soldiers asking questions in the southern villages. Someone had reported seeing a tall foreign man near the coast. Lord William had offered a reward, 50 gold pieces for information leading to the capture of the escaped Viking and the traitorous girl who'd freed him. "We should leave," Eric said that night, his jaw tight with tension. "Head further north, find somewhere more remote." But before they could act, the net tightened. It happened on a gray morning when fog rolled in from the sea like ghostly fingers. Ilara had gone to the tide pools to gather mussels, leaving Eric sleeping in the cabin. She was bent over the rocks, her basket half full, when she heard the sound that turned her blood to ice. Horses, many of them. She scrambled up the rocky path, her damaged leg nearly betraying her on the slippery stones. Through the thinning fog, she saw them, at least a dozen soldiers surrounding the cabin, their weapons drawn, their faces grim with purpose. Lord William himself sat astride a black stallion, his expression carved from stone. Ilara's scream pierced the morning air. "Eric, run!" But there was nowhere to run. The cabin backed against cliffs that dropped 50 feet to jagged rocks and churning sea. The only path led directly through the soldiers. Eric emerged from the cabin, and Ilara saw him assess the situation in an instant. The trapped position, the overwhelming numbers, the impossibility of escape. His eyes found hers across the distance, and what passed between them needed no words. This was the end of their borrowed time. "Don't hurt her!" Eric shouted, raising his hands in surrender. "She's innocent. I forced her to help me, threatened her family. She had no choice." "Liar!" Ilara screamed, stumbling forward. Two soldiers caught her arms, holding her back as she struggled. "I chose this. I chose him. Everything I did freely." Lord William dismounted, his boots crunching on the sandy ground. He looked at them both with something between disgust and weary resignation. "Take them," he ordered. "Both of them. The village will decide their punishment." They were bound separately, Eric in heavy chains, Ilara with rough rope that cut into her wrists. As the soldiers loaded them onto a cart like livestock, Eric fought against his restraints, trying to reach her. "Ilara," he called out, his voice breaking in a way she'd never heard. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," she answered, her own voice surprisingly steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I'd do it all again. Every moment, every choice." The journey back took 2 days. They were kept separated, but Ilara could see Eric in the other cart ahead of hers. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and in those brief connections she found strength. Whatever came next, they would face it together, even if together meant only in spirit. The village they returned to was not the one Ilara had left. Someone had painted her father's old shop with accusations, "Traitor's daughter," in angry red letters. The crowd that gathered as they entered was larger and more hostile than before, their faces twisted with righteous anger. Children threw rotten vegetables, women spat, men shouted for immediate execution. But there was something else in the crowd too, a small knot of people who didn't shout, who watched with troubled eyes. Old Martha, who'd bought Ilara's sewing for years. Young Thomas, the baker's son, who'd been kind to her once. Father Benedict, his face aged beyond the weeks that had passed, looking at her with profound sadness. They were taken not to the cells, but directly to the village square, where a makeshift trial had already been arranged. Lord William stood before them like judge and executioner combined. "Ilara, daughter of Thomas," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd, "you stand accused of treason against your lord, of aiding an enemy of the crown, of bringing shame upon this village. What say you?" Every eye turned to her. This was the moment to beg, to plead, to renounce everything and perhaps save her life. The old Ilara, the useless one, the frightened girl, would have crumbled. But that Ilara no longer existed. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met Lord William's gaze without flinching. "If loving someone is treason," she said clearly, her voice ringing across the silent square, "then yes, I am guilty. If showing mercy is a crime, then punish me. But I will not apologize for seeing humanity in a man you called monster. I will not regret choosing love over hate." The crowd erupted in chaos, some shouting for her death, others strangely silent. Lord William raised his hand for quiet, then turned to Eric. "And you, Viking, you've brought nothing but pain to this land. He saved lives," a voice interrupted. Father Benedict stepped forward, his priest's robes rustling in the wind. "My lord, there's something you should know." The crowd hushed. The priest continued, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. "When they escaped, they passed through the northern farms. There was a fire, the Miller family's barn, with the children trapped inside. This man," he pointed at Eric, "could have kept running. Instead, he went into those flames and carried out all 3 children. He saved them at great risk to himself, asking nothing in return." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lord William's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt. "Is this true?" he demanded. "It was the right thing to do," Eric said simply, as if that explained everything. Ilara stared at him, learning something new even now, that this man she loved had risked his freedom, perhaps his life, for strangers. Tears blurred her vision, but they were tears of pride mixed with fear. Old Martha stepped forward next, her weathered voice carrying surprising strength. "The girl sewed clothes for my grandchildren when I had no coin to pay her. She never asked for anything in return. She mended my wedding dress when no one else would," another woman added hesitantly. One by one, small voices rose from the crowd. Tiny acts of kindness Ilara had long forgotten. Small moments of grace she'd offered without expectation of reward. Not everyone spoke. Many still called for blood. But enough voices rose to create doubt, and doubt was a crack in the wall of certainty. Lord William stood silent, his hand on his sword, his face unreadable. The fate of 2 people who should have been enemies but had chosen to become something else hung in the balance, waiting for a decision that would define not just their futures, but what kind of justice this village believed in. The trial stretched into the afternoon as the sun climbed higher, bearing witness to a judgment that would test the very soul of the village. Lord William paced before the crowd like a caged animal, torn between the vengeance his heart demanded and the justice his position required. The testimonies had complicated what should have been simple: execute the enemies and restore order. But nothing about this was simple anymore. "The law is clear," Lord William finally said, his voice heavy. "Aiding an enemy of the crown is treason. The punishment is death." He paused, and in that pause, Alara felt her heart stop. However, the law also recognizes acts of mercy and valor. This court must weigh both scales. He turned to Alara first, his eyes harder than stone. "You freed a prisoner who was rightfully captured in war. You fled justice and lived in defiance of your Lord's command. You chose a Viking over your own people." Each word fell like a hammer blow. "Yet witnesses speak of your kindness, of a gentle soul who harmed no one beyond breaking chains." Then he faced Eric, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition of one warrior seeing another, perhaps. "You are the son of the man who murdered my brother. Your blood carries that stain. Yet you saved children from fire when escape was within your grasp. You surrendered rather than let this girl face danger alone. These are not the actions of the monster I expected to judge." The crowd held its collective breath. Somewhere, a baby cried. A horse stamped its hooves. The world seemed to wait. "I offer you a choice, Alara," Lord William said, and his voice carried a terrible finality. "Renounce this man. Swear before God and this village that you were coerced, that your actions were born of fear rather than love. Do this, and you will be spared. You may return to your life, your name cleared." The crowd erupted with shouts of approval. This was mercy, they cried. This was justice tempered with compassion. All she had to do was lie, pretend the past months had been a nightmare rather than the most alive she'd ever felt. Alara looked at Eric. He stood 20 feet away, chains binding him to a post, but his eyes held hers across that distance, and in his gaze she saw something that broke and mended her heart simultaneously. He was releasing her, giving her permission to choose life, to save herself, even if it meant destroying what they'd built together. "Choose life," he mouthed silently. "Please." Every practical bone in her body screamed at her to accept, to live, to survive. She was nobody, a crippled seamstress whose death would change nothing. What good would dying accomplish? Wouldn't it be wiser to live, to honor their love by continuing to breathe, to carry their story forward even if he couldn't? But as she opened her mouth to accept the offered mercy, different words emerged. Words she didn't plan but that felt truer than anything she'd ever spoken. "If loving someone is a crime worthy of death," Alara said, her voice starting soft but growing stronger with each word, "then I choose to die guilty. I will not stand before God and lie about the greatest truth I've ever known. Eric didn't coerce me, he didn't threaten me. He saw me, truly saw me, when this entire village had spent my lifetime looking through me as if I didn't exist." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never wavered. "You call me traitor for choosing love over hate. You call me fool for seeing humanity in an enemy. But he taught me courage. He taught me that my worth isn't measured by your approval. He taught me what it means to be truly alive, and I will not betray that. I will not betray him. If that means I die, then let me die with honor intact." The square fell silent. Even those who had shouted loudest seemed struck mute by the raw conviction in her words. Lord William's face remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a courage he hadn't expected from the village's most overlooked soul. Eric made a sound like a wounded animal. "No," he shouted, straining against his chains. "Don't do this, Alara, please. It's my choice," she called back to him and smiled through her tears. "You gave me the strength to make it." Lord William raised his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that aged him before their eyes. "You would die for him?" "I would," Alara answered without hesitation. "And I would make the same choice every day until my last breath." "And you?" Lord William turned to Eric. "Would you die for her?" Eric's answer came instantly, fierce as a storm. 1,000 times over. She is worth more than every battle I've fought, every glory I've chased. She is the only truly good thing I've ever known. Something profound happened in that moment. The crowd, which had been baying for blood moments before, stood witness to something they'd only heard about in songs and stories, a love so complete, so absolute, that death held no fear if it meant honoring that truth. Even the hardest hearts felt something shift. Father Benedict stepped forward again, his old voice cracking with emotion. "My lord, if I may speak?" At Lord William's nod, he continued, "I have served God in this village for 40 years. I have seen hate and love, cruelty and mercy, but I have never witnessed devotion this pure." He gestured to Alara and Eirik. "These two show us what love truly means. Not the easy love of convenience, but the fierce love that chooses the beloved over safety, over life itself. To execute them would be to declare that such love is criminal. What message does that send? That we are soft," someone shouted, "that we forgive enemies." "No," Father Benedict countered, "that we are human, that we can recognize redemption when we see it, that we are capable of growth beyond our hate." Lord William closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they held a terrible resolve. "The Viking will be exiled," he announced. "He will be escorted to the northern border and released. If he ever returns to these lands, the sentence of death will be carried out immediately. No exceptions." Relief and protest warred in the crowd, but the Lord continued, raising his voice. "As for Alara," he paused, looking at her with something between pity and admiration. "You have shown courage that shames many warriors I've known, but courage does not erase treason. You will be stripped of your property and banished from this village. You may never return. You leave with nothing but your life." It wasn't the mercy Alara had been offered before, but it was more than she'd dared hope. They would both live, separately perhaps, but alive. "However," Lord William added, and a strange expression crossed his face, something almost like a smile, "I cannot control where you choose to go once you leave our borders. If two exiled souls should happen to find each other beyond my jurisdiction, that is between them and God." Understanding rippled through the crowd. He was giving them a chance, a narrow, dangerous chance, but a chance nonetheless. They would live, and if they were clever, they might even live together. Ilara's knees nearly buckled with relief. Eirik's head dropped forward, his shoulders shaking with emotion he could no longer contain. "Take them," Lord William ordered. "Separate them until dawn. At first light, they will be escorted in opposite directions to our borders and released. What happens after that is no longer our concern." As soldiers moved to comply, Ilara and Eric's eyes met one final time across the square. No words passed between them, but none were needed. They had been judged, sentenced, and given an impossible gift: life, and the promise of finding each other again in a world that finally couldn't tear them apart. "I'll find you," Eirik called as he was led away. "I swear it." "I'll be waiting," Ilara answered. "Always." 6 months had passed since that fateful dawn when Ilara had been escorted south and Eirik north, sent in opposite directions with nothing but the clothes on their backs and hope burning in their hearts. The soldiers had deposited her at the border crossing, watched her disappear into the forest, and returned to report their duty fulfilled. What they didn't see was how Ilara had circled back eastward, using every skill she'd learned during her weeks by the sea. How she'd walked until her damaged legs screamed in protest, then walked further still. How she'd traded her labor in villages that didn't know her story, stitching and mending to earn passage ever closer to the coast, where her heart insisted she'd find him. The war, mercifully, had ended. News traveled slowly to remote places, but eventually Ilara heard that treaties had been signed, that the Wolf clan and the English crown had found an uneasy peace. Ragnar the Merciless had died. Some said in battle, others said of sickness, and with his death, the old hatred had lost its sharpest edge. The world was changing, slowly, like ice melting after a long winter. She found the village on a gray afternoon when autumn was surrendering to winter. It was small, perched on cliffs overlooking a sea that stretched endlessly toward horizons she'd only dreamed about. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, their sails patched but sturdy. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of bread and salt. And there, in a small cottage near the water's edge, she found him. Eric was mending a fishing net in the fading light, his large hands working with surprising delicacy. He'd grown a fuller beard, and his hair was tied back, and he looked thinner than she remembered. But when he sensed her presence and looked up, those ice-blue eyes were exactly as they'd lived in her memory every single day of their separation. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Eric dropped the net and crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground, burying his face in her hair as his entire body shook with the force of emotions too large for words. "You found me," he whispered hoarsely against her neck. "God, you found me." "Did you doubt I would?" Ilara asked, pulling back just enough to see his face, to touch his cheeks, to confirm he was real and solid and here. "Every day," he admitted, and laughed through tears that now flowed freely. "Every single day I doubted. But every day I also prepared just in case. I built us a home, Ilara. I built us a life to step into." He led her inside the cottage, and Ilara's breath caught. It was small but beautiful in its simplicity. A sturdy table he'd clearly crafted himself. A bed with clean linens, windows that looked out over the sea. And in the corner, almost hidden, a wooden chest that he opened to reveal fabric. Different colors and textures, threads in every shade, needles of various sizes. "For you," Eric said softly. "So you could work, so you could create. I didn't know when you'd come, but I wanted everything ready." Ilara touched the fabric with trembling fingers, then turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "You waited. I would have waited forever," he said simply, pulling her close again. "You're my home, Ilara. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." They held each other as darkness fell outside, as the sea whispered against the rocks, as the world continued turning, but seemed to pause just for them in this small cottage that held everything that mattered. In the weeks that followed, they built their life together. Ilara opened a small seamstress shop in the cottage, and word spread quickly about the quality of her work. She stitched clothes for fishermen's families, mended sails, created beautiful things from simple materials. Eric worked with the fishing boats, his strength and knowledge of the sea making him valuable despite his foreign origins. Some locals were suspicious at first, but the couple's quiet dignity and genuine kindness slowly won even the hardest hearts. They married in a small ceremony with Father Peter, the village priest, officiating. It wasn't the grand wedding Ilara had never imagined having, but it was perfect, just the two of them, a handful of curious villagers, and vows spoken with absolute truth. When Eric slipped a simple iron ring onto her finger, Ilara felt more wealthy than any queen. Months turned to years. Their cottage became known as the place where broken things were mended, not just clothes and nets, but sometimes hearts too. People began coming from distant villages, drawn by stories of the seamstress who'd loved a Viking and the warrior who'd learned to create instead of destroy. Some came seeking their craftsmanship. Others came simply to witness proof that love could bridge impossible divides. One spring afternoon, 5 years after they'd found each other again, an old man appeared at their door. He was bent with age, his beard white as snow, but his eyes held keen intelligence. He introduced himself as a traveling chronicler, one who collected stories to preserve for future generations. "I've heard tales of you," he said, settling into the chair they offered. "The seamstress and the Viking. Some say it's just a legend, but others swear it's true. I've come a long way to hear your story, if you'd share it." Ilara and Eric exchanged glances, having learned to communicate entire conversations in a look. Then Ilara smiled and began to speak, her voice steady and clear as she wove their history into words. She spoke of being called useless, of finding worth in unexpected places, of chains broken and choices made, of love that refused to bow to hate. When she finished, the chronicler sat silent for a long moment, his eyes misty. "That's a story worth preserving," he said softly. "A story the world needs to hear. That we're more than our origins, more than what others name us. That love isn't weakness, but the bravest choice we can make. After he left, promising to share their tale in towns and courts throughout the land, Ilara and Eric walked hand in hand to their favorite spot, a cliff overlooking the endless sea. The sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, and the wind carried salt and promise. "Do you have regrets?" Eric asked, as he sometimes did, still unable to fully believe she'd chosen this life. Ilara looked up at him, at the face she'd memorized in darkness and lamplight, in fear and in joy. "Only one," she said, and when concern flashed across his features, she smiled. "That I didn't find you sooner." Eric laughed, the sound rich and free, and pulled her close. "They called you useless," he murmured against her hair. "But it was with these hands I saved you," Ilara finished, a phrase that had become their private truth. "And it was with your love that I learned freedom," Eric replied, as he always did. They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, two souls who'd defied the world to find each other. The village below began lighting evening lamps, creating constellations of warmth against the gathering dark. Somewhere, their story was being told around fires, in taverns, in great halls, the tale of how love conquered hate, how courage bloomed in the unlikeliest heart, how two people chose each other when the world demanded they remain apart. But here, on this cliff, they didn't think about their story or their legend. They simply existed in the present moment, scarred but whole, tested but unbroken, together against whatever might come. The seamstress and the Viking, the useless girl and the enemy warrior, now simply Ilara and Eirik, two people who had stitched their lives together with threads stronger than steel. And as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, they walked home hand in hand, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that as long as they faced it together, they could weather any storm. The thread the seamstress had sewn all those years ago in a dark prison cell had held. Against all odds, against every force that tried to tear it apart, it had held. And it would hold forever, binding two hearts that the world had tried to separate, but that love had made eternally inseparable. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in warriors or kings, but in the hearts of those the world has overlooked. Ilara was called useless her entire life, defined by a limp she couldn't control, invisible to everyone who should have seen her worth. But when faced with the choice between safety and love, between acceptance and truth, she discovered that real strength has nothing to do with a perfect body or society's approval. She chose to see humanity in an enemy, to offer mercy when the world demanded vengeance, to stand firm in her love even when it meant losing everything. Ask yourself, would you have that courage? When the entire world tells you something is wrong, when choosing love means choosing exile or death, would you be brave enough to follow your heart? Eric learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about choosing who you become despite it. Born into violence, raised for war, he could have remained the monster everyone expected. Instead, he allowed a gentle seamstress to teach him that true strength lies in creation, not destruction. Together, they proved that we are not prisoners of our origins, that love can build bridges across the deepest divides, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to see the humanity in another person. Their story reminds us that the labels others place on us, useless, enemy, different, don't define our worth. Only we can decide who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe that love can conquer even the deepest hatred, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video to help others discover this tale of courage and redemption. And subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the extraordinary power hidden in ordinary hearts. Because somewhere out there, someone feels useless, overlooked, invisible, and they need to know that their story, like Ilara's, is just beginning.